So in the second part of our lecture material, we're going to look at themes, some of the themes in Beowulf. There are lots of them, but we're just looking at three particular ideas. We're looking at the idea of Christianity and fate, those two concepts. We're going to look just really briefly at the idea of sanctuary and security. And finally, we're going to look at the traits of a Germanic hero. Beowulf is an example of a Germanic hero. Lots of different kinds of heroes, and literary heroes share a lot of things in common, but they also have peculiarities based on individual cultures. So we'll look at some of those individual peculiarities of the Germanic hero. We're going to maybe, we'll see, look at some other epic literature in the course, and we'll talk more about conventions and characteristics of epic later. But here we're just going to look at epic poetry, just a couple of ideas that are that have to do with Beowulf. All right, so let's get going here. So we suspect that the poem was probably written down in a monastery by some sort of clergy. Monks at this time would have been the only one, some of the few who were actually literate. The literacy rate was very low in Europe at the time, so we suspect that his Christian faith really came out in the transcribing of the poem. So as we go through the story, you would see lots of references to Christianity. We see the Old and New Testament and various things like that. Well, mostly the Old Testament. But we also have the concept of fate, or the word is also known as weird, and you might have come across this, particularly those of you who read fantasy literature or play fantasy video games, that sort of thing. So the poem was written after Christianity came to England, but just barely. Christianity came kind of late to Scandinavia in particular, but also to England. So there are pagan and Christian ideas running together in the poem. So the idea of fate, weird is an unalterable fate. All right. So you'll see references to the gods with a G, with an S, like a plural, and this idea of fate that doesn't really match the idea of Christianity. Christianity doesn't really believe in fate. There's an afterlife and a way to live one's life, but fate is not really quite the same thing. This is this idea that it's kind of written in the stars, for example, of what's going to happen to you. So you have those two concepts battling each other throughout the poem. And I have a couple of examples of both faith and Christianity in here that you can look at later. The one thing I wanted to talk about was safety. I showed you earlier the picture of the mead hall, and I mentioned that that was kind of a sanctuary where the men would feel safe. And that's, it's kind of an extreme world at this time. The weather was extreme, particularly in Scandinavia where the setting took place. There were a lot of battles and fighting, and the mead hall was a place where there, as it says here, heat and light, rank and ceremony, human solidarity and culture. So when Grendel comes, he destroys that feeling of safety. And you can see this running throughout the poem as well. And finally, let's look at some of those traits of the Germanic hero. War and battle is the lifeblood of the Germanic hero like Beowulf's. One's reputation as a man is based on how well one does on the battlefield, how loyal you are to your king or your chieftain, your courage, your skill in battle. And that skill in battle was rewarded. The king provided food and armor, and the warriors offered loyalty in return. So you see that symbiotic relationship between the leader and his followers as you go through. We mentioned the giving of rings earlier. So the warriors must be undividedly loyal to their lord. So sometimes they were put in a position where they would have to choose between being loyal to their family, for example, or being loyal to their leader, their king, their chieftain, and that put them in awkward positions. But it's a ruthless and dangerous world, and one had always to be ready to do battle. And a warrior's biggest desire was to be remembered after death. There's no indication of an afterlife in the poem. The belief system is that the only way you're going to be remembered is in song and story, so your good deeds had to be good enough and big enough to be remembered and told after you were gone. And the final thing I want to point out is you get this idea of retributive justice. This idea that you killed my brother, I'm going to kill your brother. You raped my wife, I'm going to rape your sister, right? This kind of whatever happens on one happens to the other. That obviously can lead to decimations of, of peoples. So something developed called Wehrgeld, a man price. You killed my brother, you give me, 500 gold pieces and we'll call it even, right? So there's a price. And there are certain codes, legal codes, where you can see what the price of various people, cattle, property is. So that kind of kept revenge killings from taking over and leading to these, generation-long self-perpetuating feuds. So these are just some of the many traits in Beowulf that I want you to be familiar with.